Hi guys, welcome back. I'm Anna, a clinical psychology doctoral intern. Today we're going to be talking about the effects of growing up with a BPD parent. So the information in this video I've sourced from a sort of critical review of all the research on this topic, specifically looking at BPD mothers, and the second one from this book, Stop Walking on Eggshells, which is not specific to parents or mothers. And so for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to be saying BPD parent, but if it is specific to BPD mothers in the research, then I'm going to specify that. Before we get into it, I just want to say, when I talk about a parent with borderline personality disorder, the information that I'm going to be talking about is going to be largely specific to people with untreated borderline personality disorder. And this is important because any sort of untreated illness, be it a personality disorder, an anxiety disorder, a trauma disorder, whatever it is bound to have adverse effects on the children of the person with that untreated disorder. But I know many people who have borderline personality disorder. Some of you are even on this channel, I've seen you comment, who I know do not cause harm to others, try their very best to improve themselves, and go through agony as a result of this disorder. So we need to be very mindful. I'm going to be mindful in this video, and I encourage you all to be mindful as well in the comments about not further stigmatizing a disorder that is so painful for the people experiencing it and sometimes for the people around them as well. I usually liken borderline personality disorder to kind of like going through life without skin, where everything is just very painful that brushes up against you. What a person without BPD might just experience as, a slight tingle, a person with BPD, it feels agonizingly painful. So I almost didn't make this video because I don't want for this video to further add to the stigma against BPD. But at the same time, I think it's really important for people who were raised by someone with untreated BPD to hear that validation and to hear that these are common reactions that can happen as a result of that and that there's not something wrong with them. This is just kind of how things tend to go when someone is a parent and has untreated borderline personality disorder. So first I'm going to be looking at along the lifespan, and that research comes primarily from borderline mothers, and then looking more in general at the parenting styles of someone with borderline personality disorder and the effects on adult children, or regardless of the child's age. So in infancy, we see that babies of mothers with borderline personality disorder tend to be less responsive to their mothers. They're more avoidant, they tend to be more dazed. Very early on, it seems like this pattern is established where already the child is sort of rejecting or avoiding their mother. And that, of course, will only make things worse in the long term because, as we know, fear of abandonment is very core to borderline personality disorder. And so if a mom already feels like her baby is rejecting her, that's bound to set up a pattern throughout their life. Mothers with untreated borderline personality disorder also tend to be more neglectful of their infants. They're less involved in the infant care. They might take actions that are dangerous for the infant, such as smoking around them or not putting them in the correct position. And infants of these mothers often end up developing an insecure attachment style because they're not really getting that sense of security and safety from their mother. So already they're being set up to relationally move through the world as if safety is not something that is possible. Then when the children grow up to be toddlers, a little bit older, we see this pattern where they are at the same time infantilized, treated as younger than they are, but also parentified, where the roles are sort of reversed. Whereas the mother is supposed to take care of the child, it kind of becomes vice versa, at least emotionally, where the child is held responsible for the mother's state of mind and emotional needs, and the toddler's needs are not really considered. We also know that for mothers, when they have a child at this age, they tend to be less sensitive to the child's needs and also more distressed. Parenting is very stressful, and when a person with borderline personality disorder feels distressed, sometimes it can result in abusive practices. Because you're having trouble regulating that distress for yourself, sometimes it can be externalized, meaning it's put on the people around you. Then in young children, so age 4 to 7, we see in children that they have poorer emotional regulation already. Again, more of that role reversal, more of the parentification. Children at this age will even start to develop fear of abandonment, which is sort of surprising because you would expect a parent with borderline personality disorder to not want their child to abandon them and to sort of suffocate them in that way. But there are also times when they actually do abandon them, because borderline parent abandonment of their children is also a phenomenon that we see. Children of this age also start to have more shameful depictions of themselves. In the way that they speak about themselves, there's a lot of shame and guilt already. Then in school-age children and adolescents, that's where we really start to see a lot of those symptoms starting to develop, both internalizing, meaning they're turning inward, such as low self-esteem, and externalizing, such as things that affect the people around them, like aggression. Children of this age are at higher risk of actually developing borderline symptoms themselves, as well as ADHD, depression, delinquency, aggression, lack of self-identity. Because if you think about it, if you've been sort of over-controlled or isolated or molded to be an extension of your parent, then it's going to be quite difficult to figure out what is my own identity, what are the things that I like, what are my values. It's kind of been handed to you that you're supposed to like and value the exact same things as your parent. And of course, shaky self-identity is also a symptom of borderline personality disorder. So if you have a parent with shaky self-identity who is then trying to mold you into their own identity, it stands to reason that you yourself are going to have an unstable sense of who you are in the world. Children and adolescents at this age are also more self-critical, less compassionate with themselves. They have lower self-confidence and again, poorer emotional regulation like their parents. So that is sort of moving from infancy up to adulthood, but what about once you're in adulthood or across all age spans? What are some of the things that we tend to see in how a parent with borderline will parent their child? Borderline personality disorder is, in a word, about instability. And I don't mean that in the stigmatizing sense of like, you're so unstable, you need to get help. I mean that in the sense of like literally inconsistencies and contradictions. We see things like you're the best person in the world and you're the worst person in the world, alternating in terms of how somebody views the people around them when they have borderline personality disorder. Borderline is associated with instability in mood, in identity, in relationships, in the way that they think about other people, and so it stands to reason that this is going to be the phenomenon we see in borderline parenting as well. We see a lot of instability in the way untreated borderline parents parent their children, such as in attachment, fluctuations from being overly attached and overly involved in suffocating and stifling the child to actually kind of neglectful and abandoning. There's this juxtaposition between I don't want my child to abandon me and I need to abandon my child because a better opportunity has come up for me. You know, like sometimes we'll see someone with untreated borderline neglect their children for a new romantic partner, for instance. But when a parent is in one of those moods of I don't want my child to abandon me, that can result in things like isolating the child, not letting them interact with people their own age or children, or developing other friendships. It might even result in triangulation or jealousy when the adult child is starting to date and have a romantic partner. It might result in what we call emotional incest, which let me know if you want a video on that specifically, but it's this idea that instead of the parent taking care of the emotional needs of the child, it's reversed, where the child is supposed to take care of the parent's emotional needs and is treated more like an adult, more even like a romantic partner than as an actual child. We also see instability or fluctuations in terms of level of involvement in the child's life. A parent with untreated BPD could be controlling or could be neglectful. There's also instability in the level of warmth. You know, sometimes a parent with BPD is overly warm and affectionate, and other times may seem aloof or dismissive or cold, because it kind of depends on their mood state in the moment. It kind of depends on what are their own emotional needs in that moment. A parent with borderline might also have instability in the way that they perceive the child. Sometimes they might idealize their child and say, you never caused me any trouble, you're the best kid. Other times it might be, you are the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And inconsistency in parenting is a big no-no. Some people would argue that it's actually more important to be consistent with your child than it is to be positive in the way that you parent your child. Because if you think about it, when a child doesn't know what to expect from a parent on a given day, they don't know if they're getting the nice mom or the mean mom, they're walking on eggshells, and it results in the state of hypervigilance, where every single moment of their life, they're wondering, is it safe? Is it dangerous? Where I am today? I don't know. When a child is growing up, their brain is very plastic, meaning it's being molded and oftentimes in quite permanent ways, about how they can expect to move through the world, what they can expect of other people, how they can view themselves. So it can be very detrimental for a child very early on and throughout their life course up until adulthood and sometimes afterwards to get the message that life is not safe, because it sets their brain up to say, okay, be hypervigilant for signs of danger at all times. And also we tend to see that borderline parents have more insensitive forms of communication, such as being critical, intrusive, or making frightening comments and behaviors. There is this concept in the literature of borderline rage. I'm sure a lot of you people have heard of narcissistic rage, but there is also something called borderline rage, which is slightly different. It's triggered by perceived threats of abandonment rather than perceived threats at one's self-esteem, like it would be in narcissism. What are the effects of a borderline parent on an adult child of someone with untreated borderline? Interestingly, we see a lot of intergenerational transmission of borderline. And of course, you see this in all types of parenting styles. If you have an anxious parent, that's what's modeled to you. That's what is seen as your baseline, as normal. And it makes sense that you would also start to emulate and replicate those behaviors when you are an adult. With borderline, it's slightly different. Not only is there a high genetic heritability of borderline personality disorder, estimated to be around 42 to 69%, but also there's the environmental piece. Because in borderline conceptualizations, there's this theory called the biosocial model proposed by Marsha Linehan, who is one of the leading researchers of borderline personality disorder, created dialectical behavioral therapy, which is the go-to mechanism for treating borderline. And the biosocial model says that it is this genetic predisposition to emotional dysregulation combined with an invalidating environment that causes borderline to develop. So a parent with borderline personality disorder, in all likelihood, has a genetic predisposition to it and grew up in a somehow invalidating environment. But then this parent, by having untreated borderline personality disorder, then invalidates their own child. Then this child also has a genetic predisposition to emotion dysregulation and an invalidating environment, so it makes sense that that child would also then develop it. It doesn't always happen this way. I know it's very common for people who grew up with parents with personality disorders to fear that they themselves have one, but there certainly are situations where someone grew up with a borderline parent, has a predisposition to it, but actually ended up developing in a very different way because of a number of different factors. So that's an option as well. You could have the disorder, you could not have the disorder, and also you could have symptoms or tendencies in line with borderline personality disorder, but not the full-fledged disorder. For instance, it wouldn't be uncommon for a child who grew up with a borderline parent to also develop a fear of abandonment, black and white thinking, reckless risk-taking behaviors, either because of the borderline parent or because of the traumas endured, substance abuse, eating disorders, hurting themselves, unstable relationships with others, unstable identity. It wouldn't be unheard of for a child to have these commonalities with their parent without having the actual disorder, or even having these symptoms as a trauma reaction temporarily, not necessarily because they're going to have borderline personality disorder their whole life, but because they grew up in an invalidating or abusive environment in which this is the way that they are trying to cope with things. We also see this cluster of reactions where people are very perfectionistic, have very low self-esteem, this inner critic chattering in their brain all the time, and a state of anxiety or hypervigilance. In children of parents with untreated borderline, this can come up because you were shamed and guilted and criticized a lot growing up, and so of course you're going to internalize that as I'm a bad person. In borderline personality disorder, something happens called good object, bad object. This is a theory from psychodynamic branches of therapy, which says that when an infant is growing up, they don't have an understanding that the mommy who's sometimes nice to them is also the mommy who's sometimes mean to them. So there's this idea that the good object or the good mother and the bad object or the bad mother cannot coexist. You can't integrate them into one mental construct in your head when you are an infant. And if you have a particularly unhealthy caregiver at that very young age, or you're experiencing some form of invalidation or neglect or abuse at that very raw age, that ability never quite develops. So you move through life in a way thinking always kind of like an infant, that this person is either the best thing that ever happened to me or the worst thing that ever happened to me. You cannot integrate that this person is actually both good and bad, has some good qualities, has some negative qualities. The idea of integrating those two is what we would call dialectics, the whole basis of dialectical behavioral therapy, understanding that two seemingly contradicting concepts can actually coexist, that life is actually very gray, not so black and white. The reason I'm telling you this is that when you are the bad object in your parent's mind, it's very difficult to not internalize that and to think, I'm a bad person, there's something wrong with me. Every time I move through life, even as an adult, there's this sense of guilt and shame. And hypervigilance is also very common because, like I said, you need to constantly be surveying your environment for signs of, am I getting the happy mom or the sad mom today, the angry mom or the compassionate mom? These unpredictable outbursts have you kind of walking on eggshells, which internally results in this state of hypervigilance or anxiety. Then another cluster of what we see in children who are raised with an untreated borderline parent is codependency, feelings of guilt, feelings of shame, difficulty setting boundaries with the parent and with other people. This is because oftentimes parents with untreated borderline will do something called emotional blackmail, which is basically instilling in the other person fear, a sense of obligation, and guilt, such as, if you don't stay with me, if you actually go out and hang out with your friends tonight, I don't know if I can handle it, or I'm going to be so upset, or even I might hurt myself. So of course, when you grow up in this state of fear, obligation, and guilt, it sticks with you. And then it's really challenging to navigate setting boundaries with other people, saying no to people. You might end up being roped into relationships with other people who have similar patterns as your parent with borderline. Or you might even not have that much exposure to other people your age, your peers, because you were isolated a lot growing up because your parent didn't want you to abandon them. It wouldn't be uncommon to see a child who was emotionally blackmailed then grow up to be someone who has difficulty saying no to people and ends up being victimized because of it. Or for them to take on the savior role. Like if you were codependent your whole life with your borderline parent and you want to save them, you want to protect them, you see it as your purpose in life to ensure that they're happy and healthy, it wouldn't be uncommon to further do that with other people, maybe even take on a caregiving career. I find it very difficult to let other people take care of you for once, because growing up you got the message that that wasn't a safe assumption to make. You were the one supposed to take care of your parent, not the other way around. So why would someone who's not your parent be able to take care of you? Then alternatively, you could have reacted to a borderline parent with the opposite, with actually running away from people, intimacy issues, commitment issues, withdrawing, self-isolating, because you were so trapped and stifled and helpless growing up that then you grow up and someone wants to get close to you and you say, no, don't get close. I know how this is going to go down. So you might avoid connection or have very strong aversion to attachment. And also we see that adults of children who grew up with a borderline parent tend to have difficulties with conflict management. Either they just don't want to have conflict, they completely avoid it because they don't want this person to have an outburst, or they sort of replicate the same habits that they saw from their parent growing up, which is very explosive outbursts and poor conflict management. There are treatments for this. So if you are a person with borderline personality disorder and this worries you either because you have children or you want to have children one day, please know that this does not mean that that's not possible. It doesn't mean that you're a bad parent. It just means that there are certain steps that you need to be committed to taking to ensure that these common pitfalls of having borderline personality disorder are not fallen into. So the one article that I looked at that had all the different studies within it said that psychoeducational interventions can be very helpful. So for a borderline parent, it's important for them to receive psychoeducation about things like parenting, like the importance of consistency in their parenting, or the importance of warmth for children. Also about childhood development so that they can expect certain things of their child so that they're not surprised by it. And also just certain useful skills. Dialectical behavioral therapy has a ton of great skills for borderline personality disorder. So if you are a person with this disorder and want some skills, highly recommend you get into DBT. Also, mindfulness-based parenting skills were something recommended, which again, mindfulness is actually one of the 4 chapters within DBT. But mindfulness is always important because when you're feeling distressed, it's really important to stay in the moment, to ground yourself in order to be able to accept the reality of what's happening and emotionally regulate yourself so that you're not externalizing it onto your children. Sources in the description box. Let me know what you thought, and I'll see you soon.